The ship's engines beat like a dying heart beneath the iron deck, one pulse for every mile that carried them toward the unknown. Salt spray coated everything: the railings, their faces, the buttons on their gray prison uniforms. The Atlantic wind sliced through them, carrying the smell of metal and coming rain. Standing at the starboard rail was General Karl Heinrich Vogler, 52 years old, a commander who no longer had an army to command. Just 1 month ago, he had led 15,000 men near the Rhine River. Now he was one of 60 generals locked on this transport ship, sailing toward an enemy's land. The rules said they could not speak to the crew. But rumors spread like fever between the prisoners, filling every corner of the deck. "America is burning," one officer said. "Their cities are in ruins. They need us as prizes to show their people." Another man whispered, "It's all theater. They will march us through their streets so the mobs can jeer at us." A third voice, hollow and certain, "They are starving behind their machines. They live on canned food and empty promises." Vogler said nothing. The Reich's propaganda machine had hammered these lies into every radio broadcast for years. But doubt, once it enters the mind, grows in silence like rust on steel. At dawn, the call came, "Land ahead." The prisoners were ordered onto the deck. Boots scraped against metal, guards shouted commands. Diesel engines rumbled as the ship crept forward through thick gray fog. Then the mist opened like a curtain, and shock swept across the deck like a cold wave. New York Harbor stretched before them, not in ruins, but blazing with life. Massive cranes moved like iron giants, lifting what looked like entire city blocks. Ferries cut white ribbons across the dark water. Freight barges heavy with coal slipped beneath skeletal bridges that caught the morning light and threw it back like mirrors. Beyond them rose towers, endless rows of glass and stone, untouched by war, sharp and clean against the climbing sun. The skyline looked impossibly alive. Vogler stared at it, the salt spray stinging his eyes. "It's a trick," his aide whispered beside him. "An illusion." No one answered. Even the ship's guards seemed quieter now, as if the view had humbled everyone, friend and enemy alike. Then came the smell, the rich sweetness of oil mixing with roasted coffee drifting from the shore warehouses, the faint scent of fresh-baked bread. It was the smell of a civilization he had not breathed in years. His mind flashed suddenly to Berlin. Streets buried in rubble, charred plaster dust choking every breath, the stench of despair baked into broken stone. Here, the wind carried plenty. The prisoners lined the rail, frozen, a gallery of men whose certainty had just cracked open. General Hermann Dentz, once a decorated staff officer, spoke without any trace of mockery. "They told us democracy was weak and soft. Perhaps it was simply never hungry." Others sneered by reflex, but their eyes gave them away. Curiosity had replaced contempt. As the ship glided past Staten Island, they saw her, the Statue of Liberty. Her green torch caught the new sun like polished gold. Nervous laughter rippled through the men. "So she still stands," someone murmured in German. One officer raised his hand in a half salute, caught between mockery and wonder. When the vessel finally tied up at the docks, the Americans who waited did not cheer or gloat. They worked. Cargo cranes swung overhead. Dockworkers shouted coordinates. Civilian clerks shuffled papers and stacked forms. The calm efficiency of it disturbed the generals more than hatred would have. This was victory performed not through force, but through routine. As they were led down the gangway, cameras flashed. Reporters scribbled notes while soldiers guided them toward waiting trucks. No one struck them. No one spat. Instead, an American colonel, their escort, removed his cap, nodded with respect, and said, "Welcome to the United States, gentlemen." The translator's voice repeated the words in German, and for one heartbeat they hung in the air like something unreal. "Welcome." Vogler stepped onto solid ground. The wooden dock vibrated faintly from the cranes moving freight nearby. Farther inland, the skyline shimmered through industrial haze, tanks of gasoline, lines of trucks, stacks of crates stamped with factory names he had never heard of. He realized then that every piece of industry around him worked like a symphony without a conductor. Each part followed some invisible rhythm. The dock smelled of sweat, steel, and something else, hope. The noise was fierce but organized. America's power did not come from salutes or shouting. It came from motion. Vogler turned back toward the harbor, watching the statue's shape grow smaller with distance. He felt the war shrink too, collapsing behind him into the wake that glittered briefly and then vanished. Nothing around him matched the enemy he had imagined. Germany had called this country disorganized and weak, yet it looked built by confidence itself. He found himself thinking, if this is weakness, what does strength look like? The convoy rolled forward through a city unmarked by bombs. In the hum of its engines rose a new kind of thunder, the sound of a world that had already decided what tomorrow would be. The military trucks rattled out of New York Harbor, weaving through downtown streets that gleamed under clean morning light. The generals sat in the back of open vehicles, gripping the benches as skyscrapers rose around them like canyon walls. Every window caught the sun and threw it back. From those heights hung laundry, radio antennas, and the simple rhythm of people living normal lives. No city in Germany looked like this anymore. For the high command of a destroyed Reich, the comparison was unbearable. Berlin had become soot and silence. Munich was empty shells of churches and twisted tram lines. Yet here, the enemy's city pulsed as if the war had never touched it at all. There were no ration lines, no bomb craters. Only shop windows filled with goods the generals had not seen since before the Depression: tires, fresh fruit, cameras, newspapers stacked high. A woman in a yellow dress crossed the street holding a child's hand. The convoy of German prisoners turned their heads as one, forgetting for a moment that they were captives. Their disbelief thickened into silence as the trucks moved north toward the rail yards. A few men whispered, "They are pretending. This is staged for us," but every mile brought new proof that it was not. Freight trains drifted past carrying lumber and cattle. American workers waved to the guards as if escorting enemy commanders through their city was nothing unusual. From the rail depot, the prisoners were loaded into passenger cars Pullman style, with padded seats and windows that opened easily. Even a rack for their duffel bags, the absurd comfort embarrassed them. Two guards stationed in the aisle removed their caps, nodded, and offered coffee in paper cups. For men still expecting punishment, these gestures disturbed them more than cruelty would have. The train headed south toward Fort Hunt, Virginia, then farther into the heartland. The scenery changed fast, steel and smoke giving way to green meadows dotted with barns and white-steepled towns. Children on bicycles paused to watch the train thunder past. Some waved, none shouted insults. It was the first time the prisoners had seen enemy civilians who looked untouched by exhaustion. In Europe, 6 years of war had carved faces into masks of suspicion. Here, strangers along the tracks smiled with the easy confidence of people certain of tomorrow. Their escorts said little. The commanding officer, a colonel named Williams, answered questions with polite efficiency. When asked if America had suffered much bombing, he paused as though he did not understand the question. "No Germans ever reached us," he said matter-of-factly. Then, seeing their shock, he added, "Your submarines came close. But no damage." The explanation struck them harder than contempt would have. Their enemy had been untouchable. By late afternoon, the train slowed through farmland quilted in shades of green. Vogler pressed his palm against the window and realized the tracks ran perfectly straight for miles. "Imagine laying rails this flat," someone muttered, half admiring, half aghast. They built an empire by geometry. Even their agriculture reflected strategy. Rows aligned like soldiers on drill. Barns painted bright red as if celebrating abundance. At Fort Hunt, the generals stepped into a gentler captivity than they had imagined. They were led not to cages, but to a campus of low barracks shaded by oak trees. Each group had officer quarters with clean bedding and wooden desks. Water ran clear and plentiful. Every man received 3 uniforms: U.S. Army khaki stenciled with a P, freshly laundered. Daily meals included meat, vegetables, milk, and bread baked on-site. "As prescribed by Geneva," the interpreter said, almost teasingly. Vogler noticed that rules were enforced without shouting. Orders were given once, in calm voices, and obeyed immediately. Disciplined by consent, it was a military language he did not yet speak. The United States government had several reasons for bringing its captured officers here: information, negotiation, perhaps future leverage. But the practical reason was simpler: space. American soil was far from vengeance, peaceful enough to hold enemies without hatred. Thousands of prisoners picked crops, built roads, or repaired equipment while their generals stayed in these guarded camps, undergoing long interviews supervised by polite men with fountain pens. Yet the capture created an unintended experiment. After years of preaching German superiority, the Reich's highest officers found themselves living inside an efficiency greater than anything they had built, inside a comfort maintained by ordinary citizens. At night, lying awake in spotless barracks, they listened to the country's sounds carry over the river: freight trains, church bells, laughter from nearby baseball fields. These were not the sounds of a dying nation. They were the rhythm of a country sure of its direction. The generals began asking quiet questions among themselves. How could a nation of such wealth and disorder defeat disciplined Europe? How could democracy messy, argumentative, decentralized produce power so calm? They had not been crushed by force. They were being dismantled by example. The longer they remained in America, the less their captivity felt like imprisonment. The shock of freedom inside confinement, that quiet paradox, was what unsettled them most. Fort Hunt was never meant as punishment. The U.S. Army Intelligence Service treated it as a laboratory for understanding, a place to study the minds that had driven Europe into darkness. Yet for the men behind those fences, it became something stranger, a vision of a civilization they had been blind to. Daylight revealed the rhythm of the place. Trucks brought milk from local dairies. Young soldiers in clean shirts unloaded not weapons, but newspapers. At 7 sharp, prisoners were served breakfast: oatmeal, fruit, coffee. At 7:30, lectures began. Some about agriculture, others about engineering, supposedly to keep minds occupied. There was conversation instead of force, curiosity where they had expected contempt. One morning, a U.S. officer named Captain Hollis arrived to discuss logistics. He was barely 30, with sandy hair and a calm voice that cracked into humor every few minutes. He asked General Vogler to sketch how the Wehrmacht had managed supply lines along the Eastern Front. They drew maps on the same blackboard, side by side, men who, months earlier, would have aimed artillery at each other. When the session ended, Hollis handed Vogler the chalk, still dusty on his hands. "Your roads were genius," he said. "But you ran them like a clock wound to tight." Vogler blinked at the honesty. No propaganda, just analysis. The conversation stopped him cold because it assumed equality. An enemy treating him as a peer meant the ideology he had lived by, superiority earned through titles and rank, had evaporated. By autumn 1945, the generals were moved to other camps: inland Algona, Iowa; Butner, North Carolina; Troutville, Virginia. Each move peeled away another layer of expectation. Crossing the Mississippi by rail, they saw towns buzzing with consumer life. Grocery signs lit even in full sunlight. Children dragging red wagons down sidewalks. Women in polka-dot dresses buying fruit that seemed endless. Every American landscape looked rehearsed for plenty. Propaganda had warned them that liberty led to laziness, that democracy was mob rule. But the democracy they saw wore work clothes. It farmed, paved highways, and kept factories running at dawn with no secret police watching over it. At Camp Butner, they met their guards, mostly reservists and college graduates waiting for discharge. One had studied philosophy at Ohio State. He loaned the prisoners a copy of Emerson's essays and said, "You'll like this one, Self-Reliance. It sounds like your Nietzsche, but it smiles more." The men read under bare bulbs late into the night, line by line, learning a language of authority that did not depend on fear. "No one orders him," one general murmured. "He orders himself." The small revelations kept building. When Christmas arrived, the guards hung thin paper garlands between the dining hall rafters. After the meal, turkey with cranberry dressing, nearly identical to what the Americans ate. They handed out gift parcels from aid groups. Inside each were cigarettes, writing paper, and a card printed with a single word: peace. It was not propaganda. It looked handmade, almost innocent. Vogler tested the letters with his thumb, as if the ink itself might reveal some hidden motive. No trick, just intention. Then came the meeting of opposites. General Vogler met General Claiborne Rhee, a veteran of Patton's staff who visited the camp as liaison. Rhee entered the barracks without ceremony, saluted, and said, "We never met on the field. Let's meet properly now." He clasped Vogler's hand without hesitation. The contact cut through the last emotional armor left. In that handshake was the final insult to ideology, kindness unfazed by rank. The guards noticed a change soon after. The German officer's posture, once stiff with theatrical pride, relaxed. They nodded to guards they had previously ignored. They even helped organize Sunday concerts using a donated piano. The music was not German marches, but Beethoven, chosen because it belonged equally to both sides. A week later, the local newspaper reported the event beneath an understated headline: "Former Enemies Present Recital." The article's tone matter-of-fact, almost cordial, circulated in nearby towns. Shop owners began writing to the camp commander, requesting prisoner labor for harvest seasons. In a democracy, even forgiveness became practical. For the generals, each day brought another small humiliation disguised as comfort. When new boots were issued, they were American-made but fit perfectly. When letters from Germany arrived describing hunger, Vogler noticed guilt bloom among his peers. They were eating meat twice a week while their country scraped for grain. Their captors who owed them nothing were feeding them better than home ever had. Perhaps, said General Dentz one evening, the real inequality is moral, not material. Soon the interrogations resembled less like debriefings and more like conversations about political philosophy. Hollis asked if any of them understood the word accountability as Americans used it. Vogler replied carefully, "We were accountable only upward." "You seem accountable outward to each other," Hollis smiled. "That's the difference between fear and awe." Every exchange left a bruise that healed into respect. Months turned into a curriculum of paradoxes. The longer they lived under their enemies' rules, the more civilized those rules seemed. Meals were served on time. Guards saluted politely. Justice, when discipline was needed, was handled transparently, even calling witnesses. Such procedures would have been unthinkable in their own command courts. Each night, when the distant freight whistle echoed over camps already covered in snow, Vogler would glance toward the horizon and imagine all that rail and power stretching across one continent, the solid proof of an orderless order. "They do not worship the state," he wrote in his diary. "They worship the idea that the state belongs to them." The great reversal was complete. In the country they had once called culturally inferior, they found an efficiency born not of obedience but of trust. Every horizon of barbed wire became a lesson in democracy's design. Every sunrise in captivity revealed freedom's astonishing calm. By the summer of 1946, most German generals in American camps had learned their captivity would end soon. Repatriation lists circulated, and with them came a strange sadness. Home meant wreckage. America had become the nearest working idea of civilization. For General Karl Heinrich Vogler, the final revelation came not from an interrogation or a speech, but from a simple invitation. The camp commandant had arranged a tour of a nearby town for a handful of officers judged cooperative. Vogler joined reluctantly, expecting propaganda. The trucks rolled through open gates for the first time. They passed farms so orderly they looked staged. Cows grazing within perfect fences, tractors gleaming under stored sunlight. Then came the town Ogona, Iowa. Red brick storefronts, a movie theater promoting a Sinatra film. The scent of cut hay and gasoline, yet what stunned the men most were the people's eyes. Shoppers looked up not with hatred or fascination, but with casual acknowledgement. A grocer waved. A child, seeing the uniforms, handed them a stick of gum as if generosity were reflex. To a class raised on fear, this kind of indifference felt holy. They were escorted to a grain elevator and industrial cathedral of the plains. Inside, conveyor belts clattered beneath arch beams tall as church vaults, carrying tons of golden corn skyward. An American engineer explained the process in good-humored detail. "Feeds cattle, feeds people, feeds exports, keeps liberty fat," he joked. Vogler gazed upward at the flow of grain, civilization literally ascending before him. He turned to Dentz and whispered, "They devote architecture to food." The other officer answered quietly, "And we devoted it to power." That night, back at camp, Vogler requested paper. He drafted a letter fewer than 2 pages long, addressed to no one in particular. Half confession, half farewell. "I came to this country expecting to measure its weapons and have instead measured its conscience. Here the factories sing louder than armies. They are ruled by imagination, not ideology." He left the letter unsigned, folded it into a drawer of the small writing desk provided by his hosts. When the time for departure came, the formalities were brief. Each prisoner received a ration parcel, $20 in compensation for labor, and a stamped document certifying honorable conduct. Before boarding the ship at Norfolk, the officers stood one final time on an American pier. Rain dotted their caps. Steel cranes swung overhead, unloading trucks full of household goods. War had already vanished back into production, and they'd asked Vogler what he would remember most about America. He said simply, "Its noise." The noise of creation. The voyage home mirrored the first. Yet none of them looked back with contempt. Through fog, they saw the Statue of Liberty again, a peacetime audience now greeting them not as enemies, but as men returning to history's unfinished lesson. Silence spread along the deck, Except for one whispered remark that several later repeated, "She faces east toward Europe." Perhaps still waiting for us to learn. In later years, those captured officers would cite their imprisonment in America as the beginning of their reconciliation with democracy. Some advised the rebuilding of the West German army, restructuring it along principles they had first glimpsed through barbed wire authority answerable to the governed. Others refused to serve at all, instead writing memoirs confessing that the true defeat of the Reich happened not on battlefields but in the moment they saw how decency functioned when it did not need spectacle. For Vogler, the legacy condensed into one image, a factory whistle at dawn outside Camp Elgona, rising into limitless sky. Unlike the mechanical terror of German sirens, it signaled beginnings, not alarms. Every morning it reminded him that power which serves creation instead of destruction is a rare kind of victory. Long after his return to Germany, when journalists interviewed him about American captivity, Vogler spoke softly, as though still uncertain that freedom could sound so ordinary. "They lived abundance without arrogance," he said. "It was the first time I saw authority restrained by choice. In seeing America, the conquerors finally understood that the loudest strength need not shout. Freedom's discipline, the ability to master power through grace, was the sight that ended the war for good."